Chapter 13, 1955, A Year of Mixed Blessings. 1955 was a year of mixed blessings. It was the year of final decision. We received the order of subdeacon. Within these ancient ceremonies, we took the vow of chastity and a promise of obedience. There was no turning back. I was well aware of such a serious commitment. I had been in the seminary for 11 years before giving up married life under oath and dedicating my life to the service of others in obedience to the Archbishop of Detroit and to his successors. I had looked upon that day as a great challenge. In a world full of married people, it was not easy to be unmistakably different, to give up family life, and worst of all, never to have children of my own. Since I came from a large family, the Lord would have to send me extra help. In the fall of the same year, I would be called to receive the order of deacon. This step took us ever so close to the priesthood. We could do almost everything a priest could do except celebrate Mass and hear confessions, mainly. Deacons preach, baptize, visit the sick, perform marriages, and conduct funerals or weddings without a Mass. These are all part of the purpose of the order of deacon, to give witness for Christ in the community. Quite unexpectedly, two tragedies hit our family. My father died at the end of January. I was completely unprepared for such news. I took it very hard. When my brother came to see me at the seminary during class time, I expected the worst, and got it. Only a death in the family could have us called out of class. It never dawned on me that my father would be called by God before my ordination. He was so proud to have a son become a priest and fulfill his own desire. I am sure he had thought about the time when he himself was removed from the monastery to get married and to raise sons to carry on the family name. My dad was not at all offended when I informed him of my choice to leave the Maronite Catholic rite and become a Latin Catholic. In the Roman Catholic Church, the children follow the rite of the father. I was born a Maronite, but I never attended the Maronite church, except for a wedding or a funeral. It was not part of my life. I was surprised when my father gave his approval, not that the seminary asked for it, because it was the only church he knew. What separates one rite from another is basically the language and the music. The faith of both churches is the same. Both believe in the Pope as the vicar of Christ and as the head of the church. I have to admit that though I loved both my parents very much, I always felt more attached emotionally to my mother. I stayed close to her during the funeral and tried to help her through her grieving as much as possible. She was a precious gift that I wanted to take care of and at all costs. I simply could not let anything happen to her. I often imagined how proud and happy she would be on the day I became a priest. I would always take care of her, and thank God she was still around. A few of my classmates had also lost one parent before ordination. They managed as well as could be expected. So could I. 3.5 months later, my dream burst in my face. I was walking in procession into the chapel with my class. As I made the turn down the corridor toward the chapel, I spotted my brother Tony standing there. He looked very sad. I stepped out of the procession and walked toward him. He didn't say a word. I yelled out with a cry that tore my insides out. No, 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 not Mother! Poor Tony. The messenger's job was not easy when bearing bad news. He didn't say anything. He only nodded with a fatalistic drooping of his head. I could not accept it. For some reason, males always try to be real macho and to maintain poise and strength in the face of adversity. I didn't have any of that. I burst out crying as I never did before in my life. I didn't care if the whole world was watching. How could my life ever be the same? That day would go down in my personal history as the worst day of my life. I had reached to the lowest point of darkness. Tony and I hardly spoke on the way home. We couldn't. At the wake service, we found out who our real friends were. Those kind souls who come to console us were a godsend to my sisters, my brother, and me. They all expressed comforting words. Many of those who came had also lost one or both parents and understood full well how tragic it would be to lose both of your parents so close to each other and so young. My father was 67 and my mother was 62. The funeral ceremony was in English and at the local parish of St. Bernard. My mother liked Father Kerwin. He had a joyful disposition, and she understood him better than any of the other priests. She insisted that when God called her someday, she wanted him to say the funeral. He did, and his words helped a lot. At least we could understand him. My father's funeral, on the other hand, was at the Maronite church where parts of the Mass were in Arabic, Syriac, and Aramaic. The homily was given in most educated levels of Arabic, which they teach at the university. That level of Arabic is not understood by ordinary people. None of the family understood the homily, not even my mother, who spoke Arabic fluently. To tell the truth, I thought it was an insult. I only broke down once while at home. I was standing alone in the backyard behind the house. We had just come home from the funeral luncheon for my mother, and I looked around the yard where I spent many hours enjoying the company of my parents during the summer vacation each year. While facing the fig tree my father nurtured and loved so much, something came over me and I realized I would never see my parents again in this lifetime. The thought of being an orphan overwhelmed me. My tear ducts opened and wouldn't shut down for a while. I then looked up toward heaven and shouted silently but very seriously, "Lord, how could you do this to me? How could you possibly take these two precious people from me just when I'm about to dedicate the rest of my life to your service? I am giving you my life, and this is what I get?" I think St. Teresa was right when she complained to you also. What she said was so true. No wonder you have so few friends. Look how you treat them. Getting over the death of both of my parents did not take place that day. It took time to reconcile with God over my hurt feelings. But time is a great healer. After a period of time, and later after a serious study on the subject of life and death, my understanding of the process and purpose of life here on earth sharpened greatly. In fact, I came to fully accept my parents' transition to the spirit world. They had completed the mission God gave to them, and it was reward time for them. To hold them back for my sake would not be in their best interest or mine, even though it was only natural to want them present at my ordination. Actually, I believe with all my heart that they were present in spirit. I also considered the possibility that God was really protecting me and my parents from what could have been a horrible, tragic situation if they had held on longer. Thoughts flashed in my mind. What if Mother died the day before ordination, or had a heart attack the very day that I was to be ordained? Or what if she and Dad went into a coma on the same day, etc.? As I prayed, I realized it was best the way it happened. In faith, I acknowledged once again God's divine providence at work. My parents were joined together in the hereafter as they were here, and they could watch over me from above. Still, once in a while, I do wish that the outcome had been different. About a week before taking solemn vows, seminarians are required to make a retreat. The retreat is quite important because this step in accepting the order of subdeacon carried with it the vow of chastity and the lifelong commitment of obedience to the Archbishop of Detroit and to his successors. The vow was taken with some fear and apprehension because there was no turning back once you willingly made this commitment. The vow of chastity was a necessary part of the priestly package. since the Catholic Church in the West held to the tradition of an unmarried priest. I had always personally believed that priests should have a choice, but I knowingly and reluctantly accepted the challenge. We, as a class, were still young and confident that God's grace would uphold us in time of prosperity or adversity. Ordinarily, the 2 weeks preceding the ceremony in which we make our solemn vows was a time of elation and excitement. Each of us, scheduled to receive the order of the subdeacon, waited in our rooms for the call to this important milestone along the way to the priesthood. If we heard a knock at the door, we were greeted with a call to the sacred orders. We knew we were found acceptable by the faculty to take the step. Not all were called. Some were told to wait until a later date. Others were discouraged from continuing in their pursuit of being ordained to the priesthood. Chapter 14. Off to Mexico. An Encounter with Destiny. Summer vacation came quickly after receiving the sacred order of subdeacon. There was some concern about the type of work a subdeacon chooses to do during the 3 months of summer, since we were now permanent members of the clergy. My choice was to study Spanish in Mexico. They asked for anyone interested in Spanish to apply, and the archdiocese would finance it. Since both my parents made their transition at this time, I wanted to get as far away as I could. Mexico would be fine. I needed to forget the horrible pain I felt in my heart. Jim Sheehan, Dick Krampf, and I were selected to study basic Spanish in Mexico City. We lived at the Diocese seminary called El Seminario Conciliar, located in a suburb of Mexico City called Talpan. I had an advantage over the other two since I had spent the previous summer at the migrant camp learning Spanish every day. It was not easy for us to mix freely with the seminarians in Talpan since language and culture at first were a barrier to communication. I forgot most of the Spanish I had learned the year before. At St. John's Seminary back in the States, I was busy with Latin again. I had no time to practice the little Spanish I had learned. In Mexico, learning the proper Spanish grammar and expanding my vocabulary helped me to remember what I had learned in the migrant camps in Michigan. And to go beyond that, I finally began to speak Spanish correctly and more fluently. Between the classes at the Ibero-American University taught by Jesuits and the fun talks we began to have with the seminarians in Talpan, I was feeling good about the level of communication in Spanish. The words were flowing more easily every day. I still needed more understanding when someone spoke fast to me, but I managed to get by fairly well even when I was alone with a group speaking entirely Spanish. Health-wise, the three of us were victimized by Montezuma's revenge. Everywhere I went, I carried a bottle of kaopectate. Near the end of the summer, my body finally became accustomed to the Mexican style of cooking and the distinctive method of fertilizing their crops. Of course, we still had to be careful not to eat certain foods, regardless of how appetizing they appeared to be. Tomatoes, lettuce, and unpurified water were the biggest culprits to an American stomach. Every weekend, the three of us would go on trips to a different part of Mexico City or to one of the neighboring towns just to get a feel for Mexican customs and their way of life. It was paramount that we become more and more familiar with the culture of the people. That was one of the principal reasons for sending seminarians there. To learn Spanish, of course, but also to understand the Mexican culture more deeply. Ministry to the Hispanic community depends for its success in good measure upon the ability to identify with and be sensitive to the pre-Columbian and present culture, which has become a vital part of their life. We are well aware of many races and cultures here in the United States, which is a melting pot of ethnic backgrounds stemming from every part of the planet. Each brings a richness of their heritage to America. As enchanting as these cultures may be, their ethnic and racial differences sometimes become the source of great conflict. Each country has its own history with its distinct moral values, ideals, religious or atheistic beliefs, and, in general, cultural practices. In this country, we have to keep an open mind or we will end up with perpetual cultural hostility and bloodshed as found in Bosnia, Ireland, or the Middle East. So each weekend was a time of discovery, and we were learning fast. One weekend stood out above all the others. What I experienced affected me deeply, even to this day. It started out like any other weekend, except that I was alone. My buddies from home, Jim and Dick, wanted to go to Popo, the nickname for Popocatépetl, and its neighboring mountain, Exlahuatl. If you have trouble pronouncing these words, don't feel bad. Very few Americans can. The story of these two mountains, volcanoes, is pretty much the same story as Romeo and Juliet. Popo was of a royal family, and he loved a beautiful girl who was a commoner. They couldn't marry, so they eloped and were never heard from again. They eventually became Popo and Exlahuatl. By the way, Popo is the highest mountain in Mexico, and Exlahuatl looks like a woman lying down. In Spanish, they call Exlahuatl La Mujer Dormida, the sleeping woman. I decided not to go to the mountains with them that day. I prefer to fulfill my dreams I had for a long time. One was to go to the Basilica of Guadalupe in Tepeyac, and the other was to actually see a pyramid. I had been fascinated by pyramids all my life. Both of these sites were included on our tour from Mexico City. So I went with a tour group of about 30 people, none of whom I had ever met before. Our first stop was a basilica on the outskirts of the city. There was a lot of history at this shrine, dedicated to the Mother of Jesus, known to the Mexican people as Our Lady of Guadalupe. I could not help thinking of Our Lady of Consolation in Cary, Ohio. I thought to myself, she sure gets around a lot. I found the plaza and outside of the basilica interesting, but it was nothing compared to what was to come. Finally, the tour guide led us to the painting of Our Lady of Guadalupe. I have always seen life through the eyes of an artist, but when my eyes fell upon the image of Our Lady of Guadalupe, I was utterly speechless. I had never seen anything more impressive or inspirational in my whole life. That was my immediate response, and it still is. Its history is so extraordinary that it moved an entire country to become Christian. In 1531, Juan Diego was a peasant Indian who just been baptized a Christian, and he was going to church. He passed the usual way over a hill called Tepeyac. On one such occasion, there stood before him the apparition of a beautiful lady. She appeared to be from heaven. To remove any fear of her overpowering presence, she spoke to him lovingly, like a mother to a child. Whenever she spoke to him, she called him mi hijito, meaning my dear son, an affectionate title. She told him to go to the bishop and have him build a basilica for her. Juan Diego was doubtful that the bishop would listen to him, but he obeyed the wishes of the lady. Poor Juan waited a long time for the bishop to see him. The bishop's secretary, a Monsignor, kept telling Juan that he could convey his message to the bishop, but Juan insisted that he personally deliver this message to the bishop. Finally, he got to see him. The bishop then questioned Juan Diego as to the purpose of the visit. The heavenly lady on the hill of Tepeyac requested that the bishop build her a basilica. The bishop must have smiled as he said to him that he needed some kind of proof that she really was from heaven. So Juan felt he had failed the lady and did not go back home by way of Tepeyac, but rather went to visit his sick uncle. The next day, while going to Mass in the morning, as he usually did, Juan was again greeted by the lady. He quickly explained the situation to her, and she was not upset in the slightest. She said, "If it's proof the bishop wants, we shall give him proof." She told Juan to go a little further and pick the freshly grown roses, place them in his tilma, which was a blanket used by peasants as a cloak. He gathered as many as he could. What was miraculous about the roses was that roses do not grow in that part of Mexico in December. Juan knew that, and so he carefully guarded the roses in his tilma with both hands holding them as one would hold a basket. Again, sitting outside the bishop's office, he waited for a long time. At long last, he was told to enter the bishop's office. When the bishop asked Juan if he had brought a sign to prove that the lady who requested a basilica was authentically from heaven, Juan lowered the tilma and the roses fell to the floor. The bishop immediately fell to his knees. Juan was surprised that the presence of the roses in winter time had such an effect on the bishop. What Juan did not know was that as the roses fell to the floor, in the very presence of the bishop and a few other people in the room, the beautiful image of Our Lady of Guadalupe was being painted miraculously right on Juan's tilma. He was the last in the room to know. The painting and the roses were enough to convince the bishop to act without any doubt as to the authenticity of these heavenly visits. Bishops and priests are usually the last ones to believe in the extraordinary and miraculous events. We hear of so many phony or imagined miracles and apparitions and divine messages that we are very slow in accepting the truth of such occurrences. We have all been fooled at one time or another. We try not to be fooled a second time. And it looks bad for the church if some time later the so-called healing and miracles were proven to be false. In that light, I can fully understand why the bishop gave Juan Diego a rough time. Bishop Zumarraga was the bishop our Blessed Lady chose to have the basilica built. He and his entourage believed Juan Diego, and so he complied with the Blessed Lady's wishes. The basilica lasted about 450 years as a place of worship, with popes and other great leaders visiting as pilgrims. Besides offering Mass there, millions have gone there with the hopes of experiencing a healing. And there have been thousands of healings. Several walls in the original basilica are literally covered with little images which are symbols of the type of healings that took place. For example, tiny images of crutches or eyeglasses or a cane or a heart or whatever was the nature of the cure are hung on the wall. They are fervent reminders of the healings by God through the intercession of Jesus' mother. Whether healed or not, special honor and devotion continues daily at the shrine of Our Lady of Guadalupe and throughout the Americas. She is, in fact, the patroness of the Americas. When I heard the history behind this incredible picture, I was totally overwhelmed and drawn to the Mother of Jesus all the more. The painting is truly a miraculous work of art. As I knelt for a long time in front of this powerful image of Our Lady of Guadalupe, I knew in my heart that I would spend as much of my priesthood as possible in serving her people. Without any words, I felt in my soul that my destiny was beginning to shape, and that I would indeed dedicate my life to serving the Hispanic community. I had been waiting for a sign, and there it was. Since Mexico City and the surrounding areas are built on a lake, some of the buildings sink a few inches over each year. When the Basilica of Guadalupe sank all of 15 feet on one side, it was time to build another basilica. The new one was completed around 1980. It is very well done, a worthy basilica, but it does not carry the atmosphere of the old one. The old sinking basilica still stands, but it's off limits because of obvious danger. One last thought about the painting of Our Lady of Guadalupe. Scientists have tested the pigments used in the painting. With modern instruments, they can now break any element down to its basic molecular structure. There is no paint on this planet similar to the paint that created the image of Guadalupe. In fact, it cannot be explained adequately how the painting was done. Since a tilma is a heavy cloak used in winter, it is made from very coarse material. I did a couple of paintings on burlap years ago. It was not easy painting on burlap because of the loose and rough condition of the burlap. I can't imagine trying to paint on a tilma. The paint strokes would be ever more difficult and sloppy with the colors seeping through the material. In fact, it would be impossible to paint on it without many coats of gel to build up a smoother surface. None of the above was done. Scientists and artists to this day are puzzled as to how it was painted, since there are no specific brush strokes on the heavy material. Also baffling is the fact that for over 400 years, the faithful have burned many thousands of candles directly underneath the painting. There was no protection glass whatsoever in front of the painting, and yet the original painting was never discolored by the fumes from the candles. The painting now has a glass covering, not because of the candles so much as the senseless bombing by a very sick person about 20 or 30 years ago. I'm not sure of the date. On that occasion, the whole altar was destroyed, but the painting of Our Lady of Guadalupe was completely unharmed. The tour continues. We went on to the pyramids of Teotihuacan just outside of Mexico City. When we arrived at these famous archaeological ruins, the bus dropped us off near the Sun Pyramid. It was huge, much larger than what I imagined. There were two pyramids about a mile apart and nothing but desert in between. When we got off the bus, I immediately walked toward the Sun Pyramid. I was standing there facing the Moon Pyramid, which was considerably smaller. Just then, one of the ladies from the bus came up to me and asked, "Pardon me, but may I take a picture of you standing in front of that Sun Pyramid so that people back home can get an idea of just how big it is?" I said that would be fine. I remember seeing the flash of light from the camera when she took my picture. I then started to go and join the tour group. However, the most amazing thing happened. I said to myself, "What is this? What's going on?" I looked at my arms. They were very dark. I then noticed I had a loincloth around my waist. I felt my hair. It was straight and jet black. I kept saying to myself, "I'm a Mayan. How can this be? I am J. Samonie. How did I get here? And how do I get back?" As I was standing there in a state of complete confusion, someone came up to me speaking in another tongue, not Mayan. Nonetheless, I understood perfectly and told him how to place a large block in place. The stone must have weighed several tons. It was moved in place with a sort of pulley system, something built like the metal bars of a child's swing. Where you would expect to see a swing, there were ropes, connected to other ropes as we would use a series of chains. While one of the workers was pulling the outer rope several feet, the inner ropes attached to the stone seemed to move about an inch. I remember marveling at this makeshift pulley system. After a period of time, the block of stone fit perfectly on its proper place. It really worked. I was actually doing the work of an architect supervising the construction of 2 rows of structures that eventually joined the 2 pyramids. A moment ago, there was nothing but desert between the pyramids. Now there were people everywhere. They all had their work to do. I kept them following the plan of construction similar to blueprints. Some of the adjoining structures were homes, shops, storage spaces, or dwelling places for the priests. After a few minutes, I was a Mayan architect directing many workers. I forgot all about J. Samonie. I was well aware that the workers were not Mayan, and they spoke in their own language, which I understood. This did not happen in a mere fraction of time. I was well into this strange experience. I didn't even know what to call it. Deja vu, regression, a time warp, a memory? Something was happening to this young seminarian who never heard of such things. I was never prepared for this. How could I? I was only groomed for the Roman Catholic priesthood, taking ordinary postgraduate subjects plus added studies in theology, scripture, and philosophy. Psychology was a branch of philosophy, but nowhere was the concept of trance, reincarnation, deja vu, regression, and such topics ever mentioned. It was unthinkable. and here I was living the unthinkable. After a full hour had passed, the tour guide was counting the group on the bus to make sure everyone was present. They were about to make the trip back to Mexico City when all of a sudden he noticed an empty seat. He asked whether someone had sat there. A lady spoke up. She said, "There was a young man sitting there in that seat, but he was nowhere on the bus right now." She continued, "I took a picture of him when we first got off the bus, but I haven't seen him since." The tour guide asked if she would take another person with her and go back to the exact place where she had last seen me. The two of them went looking for me. They found me in the same spot where I was standing for her snapshot of the Sun Pyramid. They told me later my head was tilted to the side and I was standing up, but I appeared to be asleep or in a trance of some sort. First they tried speaking to me. I did not respond. Then they yelled in my ear. It did not help. Then they began to hit me, beat on me, pinch me, slap my face, anything to bring me back to consciousness. Finally, after being continually pinched or slapped around, I opened my eyes. They both said I was speaking in another tongue. They had no idea what it was. Nor did I when I realized after a few moments that I was J. Samonie again. I was absolutely stunned. I did not know what to say when I got on the bus. They all applauded the two ladies who found me, but I was afraid to mention what I had experienced. I figured they would take me to the psychiatric ward instead of the main office of the bus company. While returning to Mexico City on the tour bus, however, I thought I would take a chance to verify my sanity. When the tour guide, who was apparently very knowledgeable, asked if there were any more questions, I raised my hand. Remembering the role I had played in trance, I asked whether the Mayan Indians built the pyramids. The tour guide said, "Well, I guess you missed the whole talk I gave on the construction of the pyramids. No, the Mayans did not build the pyramids. The natives of Teotihuacan actually built them. That's why they are called the pyramids of Teotihuacan. They only brought the Mayans in as architects." I nearly jumped out of my seat. Without knowing anything at all about history of the pyramids, that was precisely what happened. I was on a roll. So I thought I would ask another important question I had to know. Was this all imagined or was it real? I asked the guide if there were any theories or even a possibility that there might be some structures buried beneath the sand in the area that joins the two pyramids. The tour guide did not respond right away. Then he said, "You ask some very interesting questions for a guy who missed my entire commentary on the pyramids," he commented. Yes, there is a very real possibility. Just recently, two archaeologists were here taking soundings, and they believe there is definitely some kind of construction in that exact area. The sands of the desert simply covered them up after so many centuries. As a matter of fact, they are going to begin excavating next year. I never felt so good. The two questions were right on target. Maybe I did have some kind of real experience of the past somehow. I neither understood it nor could I explain it, so I did not share what happened with my buddies who returned that evening from the mountains. Nor did I talk about it with anyone for a long time. How could I? Who can possibly believe this kind of talk? Maybe in the 1990s, but not back in 1955. There is a sequel to this trance experience, or whatever it was, that happened to me. In 1975, exactly 20 years later, I conducted a tour to Mexico. I made sure that the tour included a visit to the pyramids. I had not seen them for 20 years, and I never heard or read anything about them during that time. You can imagine how excited I was just thinking about the excavation and what actually did show up under the tons of desert sand. Again, the first thing I did after getting off the bus was look for the same location in front of the Sun Pyramid where I stood before. The sight was overwhelming. As I looked straight ahead in the direction of the Moon Pyramid, I saw that the two rows of stone buildings were completely excavated. It was identical to what I had seen there 20 years ago while they were buried under the sand. This was another turning point in my life. Amazing that they both took place on the same trip. First, I decided to dedicate my priestly ministry to working with the Mexican apostolate, as we called it then. Secondly, I felt, in a sense, compelled to study about paranormal events. I hoped that someday I would come up with some answers as to what occurred at the pyramids in Mexico. Thank you for listening, and please join us every Sunday at 3 o'clock for our watch party as we premiere the next chapters of Father J's book.